Thank you very much, James. I'm delighted to be back at the SAOS conference for the first time in several years, and also really pleased to be able to contribute some thinking to the discussion on home markets. I don't see home market development as optional. It's essential for Scotland's farmers, processors, retailers, wholesalers, and for Scotland's population. So let me explain why. I want to start quite high level, and bear with me, I will arrive at home markets. We've much to celebrate in Scottish food and farming, and I learned just how vibrant the sector is from Shetland to the Mull of Galloway as co-founder of the precursor to Scotland Food and Drink in the late 90s, through to stepping down as chair in 2021. During those 2 decades, I had the privilege of meeting amazing people spread across the country doing remarkable stuff. But looking down from space, if one were to do a big picture scorecard of the Scottish food system, what would it look like? So, there's a lot of value created, huge amounts of value being created. 10% of Scotland's output is coming from this sector. In terms of employment, over 120,000 people employed, and very importantly employed across the country through some 17,000 businesses, and contributing massively to the fabric of rural Scotland, not just the economic, but also the social fabric of rural Scotland. However, if we were to consider the costs of the food system to Scotland, they too are significant. We've heard already about encouragement to address biodiversity loss. This is serious, what's happening in terms of our biodiversity status. Scotland and the UK as a whole is among the world's most nature-depleted countries, ranking in the bottom 10% globally, and we're last in the G7 when it comes to biodiversity, with about half of our original biodiversity remaining, far below the 75% global average. Some of us remember having to clean the headlights of our cars after a long drive in the summer of insects. We just don't do that anymore. Carbon after transport, this sector is number 2 in terms of contributing to Scotland's carbon emissions, some 20–22%. But the trends are beginning to go in the right direction because of concerted action that is being taken by some people in this room and a much wider group. Reduction is happening. And then diet-related chronic disease. I want to come back to this in a minute, but I think I would start by saying few of us in the room are thinking enough about the impact of what we do and its effect in this domain. So what I'd like to do is just move on to explore a bit about the Scottish food system. Up until the middle of last century, we effectively had 2 sectors operating reasonably distinct of each other. 2 separate domains. There was little that our forebears did in food and farming that had much impact on the world of the medics. And the health system dealt with all sorts of issues, but few of those arose from food. And this has been the way for centuries, if you stop and think about it. Apart from tea, coffee, potatoes, perhaps blended whiskey, the diets of Henry VIII and King George VI had differed very minimally. But today it's different. We need to think in food system terms. Why is that? What has changed? Well, it's what we now eat. What we do today in the food sector is having a huge and unsustainable impact on the Scottish health sector in ways that have never been seen before. So we need to think in this holistic food system way. So what has been happening, and how best to describe what's been happening since somewhere around the middle of last century? I find the NOVA, Portuguese Venue, system of food classification that was proposed by a Brazilian nutritionist, Monteiro, in 2009, quite helpful. Now, not everyone accepts this NOVA classification system, for reasons I think you might see in the next few minutes. But this system describes three, what we might call traditional food groups. And essentially all the foods that would have made up the diets of our grandparents and all the generations before them could be slotted into one of these three groups of foods. And that group, this grouping had changed little and provided humanity the nutrition it needed for centuries. And then, mid last century, something started to happen. There emerged a group of foods. And they're described as the group 4 foods, ultra-processed foods, and they're typically, they're branded, their commercial protection is often there, and they're cleverly made from cheap ingredients from foods drawn from groups 1 to 3. So they're extracted from whole foods and then combined with a range of additives, many of these additives that had never been used before in food. And through a process or a series of complex processes, group 4 foods are brought to market. Now, by the mid-1970s, the Scottish diet had about 20% of group 4 foods in the nutritional contribution to the typical Scottish diet. By the 1990s, that was estimated to have risen to 40%. Good measurement really only began in 2008 when the National Diet and Nutrition Survey began, and we began to get hard data on this. And that showed that group 4 had risen to some 50 to 55% of the Scottish diet. So that's the total energy intake coming from that group was by 2008 over half of our diet. And our adoption in Scotland of group 4 foods has been greater than any other European country. Whilst in 2008 we were about 50–51%, Portugal was sat at 10%, Italy at 13%. So after centuries of relatively fixed mix of foods, the Scottish diet has changed radically in the space of 3 generations. So we need to then ask ourselves, in that time, over that period, what has happened to the health of the Scottish population? It's not a good news story. So body mass index for adults has risen significantly in a fairly short period of time. We've also got challenges with our young people, with our children. So in 2018, the Scottish Government introduced a childhood obesity action plan. And the plan there, the objective of that plan is to reduce childhood obesity or prevalence towards obesity from 14%, as it was in 2018, to 7% by 2030. So how are we getting on with that? Well, the 2023 number was 18%. So we're going in the wrong direction, and This is not an easy problem to solve. Weight loss medication may impact this trend for good, but it's too soon, I think, to make that call. Thinking about another big challenge we face in Scotland. In 2001, we had about 55,000 people in Scotland grappling with the really debilitating disease, type 2 diabetes. Today, it's estimated that we've got some 275,000 people diagnosed with the disease, a further 40,000 people living with it but undiagnosed. So we've quintupled the numbers of people in Scotland in a really relatively short space of time, 25 years. And it's costing big. Cost to NHS Scotland, 875 million, the direct costs of treating type 2 diabetes. And as a reference point, some of you may remember, Scottish Government is spending about 660, 680 million, somewhere in that range, on agricultural, total spend on agricultural support. Then we've got to think about lost productivity, estimates ranging 1.2 to 1.4 billion. And Public Health Scotland's estimating that if we continue on the current track, if there's no intervention, no changes, we're going to add about 110,000 to that tally by 2044 and see costs rising to the NHS of about $1.5 billion. We also have a growing group of people of working age who are not working due to diet-related chronic disease. Quite a hard number to pin down, but estimates tend to point to a figure of about 200,000 people who are not working, who could be working. The reason they're not is because of chronic food-related diseases. And internationally, we're not doing well. Data shows that Scotland has a higher prevalence of largely preventable, non-communicable conditions relative to comparable European countries, as well as the widest socioeconomic inequalities in health in Western Europe. So that's something we really need to think about. The less disposable income you have in Scotland, the poorer your experience of the food system is today. And all of this may have something to do with our embrace of Group 4 foods. So, what's our response? What's Scotland's response been to this that more and more researchers and policymakers are describing as the world's first non-communicable disease pandemic? And these problems are far from unique to Scotland. So around the world, this is an issue challenging nations. Well, Scotland started to think about the concept of food system transformation around 2014. It's a difficult concept to land. What is the food system? What are the problems we're trying to fix within it? Where do you start? And how on earth do you frame it in law? By 2018, the concept of tackling system change starting with primary legislation had crystallised, and the government issued a consultation on what should be in what was then termed a Good Food Nation Bill. And then in June 2022, the Good Food Nation Scotland Act came into law. It was one of a small handful of bills that has passed unanimously into law since the Scottish Parliament was reconvened in 1999. So there's this wide, broad unanimity that something has to be done. So what does food transformation law look like? Well, the Act describes a series of interlocking Good Food Nation plans to drive change. By law, the government is required to publish, then implement a national Good Food Nation plan and update that every 5 years each one being more ambitious than its predecessor. And the first National Good Food Nation Plan was laid before Parliament by the government 4 weeks ago. And I'd recommend it as a read if you're interested at all in this topic, and I hope most people in this room would be. It's not easy to produce a national food plan. A few countries have done it, and we now have one sat in our law in Scotland. So in addition to the National Food Plan, every local authority, our 32 local authorities across Scotland, and every territorial health board, of which we have 14, are required to produce and then implement their own Good Food Nation Plan, again on 5-year cycles. And this is not a 3-year project or something that's going to run the life of a parliament. It's a multi-decadal process. In addition, the Act called for the creation of an independent Scottish Food Commission. And in summary, the Commission has 3 main purposes. First of all, to support and challenge the government and these relevant authorities, the local authorities and the health boards, to create, then implement ambitious plans, raising the ambition cycle by cycle, because you don't fix this stuff overnight. First role, scrutiny, challenge. Secondly, to engage with actors across the wider food system in Scotland and further afield, seeking to drive food system transformation. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here today. And thirdly, to hold the torch for food system transformation across Scotland in the years to come by being accessible, being clear in our messaging, and able to listen to voices from across the spectrum. Remember, 100% of the population has a vested interest in success. Now, the first national plan has set out 6 ambitious outcomes to steer the direction of travel. The first outcome speaks about the food environment. And the food environment is another quite complicated concept. But just to say that our food environment today in Scotland, for a lot of people, does not allow them to make good decisions about the type of food they buy and consume. The second outcome speaks about a flourishing natural environment. We should not have a tension between nature recovery, nature restoration, and food production. And some people would generate that as a divisive topic. We need to find ways in Scotland of recovering our nature, reducing our carbon, increasing our biodiversity, and farming effectively. These are not in contradiction. The third outcome speaks of a physically and mentally healthy population. And you can see we've got some way to go on that. Fourthly, speaking to this sector, very importantly, we've got a sector that's, food and drink sector that's prosperous, it's economically viable, it's innovative, it's diverse, and it's contributing both to local food economies and the national picture. The fifth one is a complicated one, and it speaks about food culture. We have a thriving food culture as a fifth outcome that is being sought. Now, you can travel to different parts of the world and you will encounter different food cultures. Suffice to say, in Scotland we have room to develop a thriving food culture. And the final outcome is about our role in the wider world. This is not going to be an insular project, Scotland looking inward. We need to engage. For some of the reasons that Ali was just outlining, we're part of a broad global system. And a monitoring framework has been established of targets and indicators to track progress towards each of these outcomes over the coming years and decades. So, here we are. at home market development and good food nation. We've already had a picture of a train. This train leaves Coatbridge every morning, heading for Inverness. Some mornings with 15, some others 20, maybe 25 40-foot containers being pulled north to Inverness to supply the Tesco shops of Inverness and the north of Scotland. And it's an efficient, but it is a brittle system. It's a lot of eggs in one basket. So, think what would happen if we had a Jaguar Land Rover type cyber event hit one of our big retailers in the UK. Our food system today is more convenient, but less resilient. It's open to system shocks. A good food nation needs food security. So, as Group 4 products have been taking more of our food pound, our local food economies across Scotland over the last 70 years have been shrinking. Few farmers now produce food for their local communities. Our reliance on farmers and intermediaries a long way from Scotland has grown, as we could see from the description of the soya value chain. The Good Food Nation outcomes point to much livelier and larger local food economies than we have today. And these will help people return to a better balance between Groups 1 to 3 foods and Group 4 foods. Even getting to the European average would mark tremendous progress for Scotland, European average of that ratio. Growing local food economies will allow schools, hospitals and care homes to easily source fresh Scottish products. Today, public sector buyers that I speak to actually find it quite a difficult thing to do. And then I speak to Scottish producers, and they also find it very difficult to serve schools, hospitals, care homes, prisons, and so on. So we seem to be in something of a lose-lose situation, and that needs to change, that needs to improve. And as we grow our local food economies, as we grow our home markets, we'll have farmers be less price takers and more local market makers. That's been my own experience in North Argyll, farming in North Argyll. And if you decide to grow hemp or rosebean willow herb, you'll probably be playing in less of a commodity market than would be the case with malt and barley today. So a fundamental critical success factor to making this happen is this sector's ability to collaborate and cooperate at several levels. Collaborate in farming terms, primary, secondary processing. Collaborate around wheels, working closer with wholesalers, with distributors, perhaps looking at alternative new models of getting products to local markets. And who better to provide this leadership than SAOS and its membership? My challenge then to you is that Scotland has a unique opportunity. We have one of the best food system transformation plans in the world now in place here. And we're learning in the hard way how true Churchill's statement was that healthy citizens are the greatest asset any country can have. Too many Scots, particularly the less wealthy, are not having a good experience of our current food system. And business, as usual, will not work. Step change is required. Growing the home markets, growing our local food economies is crucial to that. With your skills and experience and cooperation, what part are you going to play in making Scotland a good food nation? The Food Commission looks forward to working with you over the coming years. Thank you very much.